The terrible scene, the worst I've ever seen in my life.
She fought like a real hero for her kids.
They were doing their homework when they got murdered.
They were stacked on top of one another, and the tub was full of water.
You can't drown children while you stare into their gasping faces without being the devil.
The devil wouldn't even come close to describing the evil behind this case. It was something far darker, beyond what words can capture. On November 20th, 2010, a frantic call from a neighbor of the Peters family set everything in motion. The mother of three hadn't been answering her phone, and when police arrived for a welfare check, they stepped into what can only be described as a living nightmare. Blood painted the walls, and the scene screamed of a violent, uncontrolled rage. A massacre that shook even the most seasoned investigators. As horrifying as the crime was, justice wouldn't come swiftly. It would take 9 agonizing years to uncover the truth, and the answer lay disturbingly close to home. Someone trusted, someone familiar. But who could carry out such an unspeakable act, and what could have driven them to it? Before we dive into the shocking details, let's take a moment to get to know the Peters family, an incredibly close-knit group of 4. At the heart of it all is the gorgeous Brandy Peters, born on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1983, in Bainbridge, Georgia. The youngest of 8 children, Brandy grew up with 3 brothers and 4 sisters before her family eventually relocated to Tallahassee, Florida, where she graduated from Godby High School. From a young age, Brandy's natural flair for hairstyling was evident, and this is a talent she proudly inherited from her mother. This skill helped her build a thriving home-based hair business, where she created stunning, one-of-a-kind hairstyles that kept her clients coming back for more. But Brandy wasn't just a businesswoman. She loved spending her time crocheting and enjoying the company of her loved ones. One of her closest relationships was with her cousin, Janet Howard. They were more like sisters than cousins, with personalities that balanced fiery energy and calmness. But in 2003, Brandy's life took a major turn when she found out she was pregnant with twins, Tamia and Tanaya, with her then boyfriend, Antonio Anthony. However, their relationship was shaken when Antonio was incarcerated, leaving Brandy to raise the girls on her own. But she wasn't alone in this. Her family, especially her mother and sister Monica, stepped in to offer their unwavering support. However, it didn't take long for Brandy to find love again with Henry Segura, a hardworking welder, and together they built a new life. In 2007, they welcomed their son, Javante, into the world. With this new addition, Brandy and her 3 kids moved into a cozy home in Saddle Creek Run, a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood. It was the perfect place to settle down, close to schools, and not far from the buzzing college scene in Tallahassee. It felt like the fresh start Brandy and her kids needed. So, as you can imagine, everything seemed perfect when you first heard about Brandy's life, right? The kids were doing well, the family was happy, and there was even a Thanksgiving trip planned to visit her cousin Janet in Tampa. But here's where the story takes a tragic turn. On the evening of November 20th, 2010, things started to go off track. Janet and Brandy's family began to get really worried. Brandy hadn't picked up her phone, and that wasn't like her at all. As a home-based hairstylist, staying connected with clients was pretty much a must. Picking up the phone wasn't even optional. After multiple attempts to reach her and getting no answer, her family decided it was time to take action. They called the police for a welfare check, hoping to get some answers about what was going on. But what they uncovered would change everything in a way no one was prepared for.
Breaking news out of northern Florida. A mother and her young children were found killed at a violent crime scene. Now homicide detectives are looking for whoever might have had a reason to harm them. Tallahassee police say the 4 were murdered at a home on Saddle Creek Run Road. Police say the children are 6-year-old twins and a 3-year-old boy. They have not released any information on who they are or how they died, but they say they are actively searching the area. The home is just a few miles from the campuses of Florida State University and Florida A&M University.
After hours of investigation, the detectives could tell that Brandy had fought for her life. There were trails of blood leading to the door where her body was found. It looked like she'd almost made it out, but then she was dragged back inside and beaten to death with a blunt object, after being shot multiple times. The brutality of it all was chilling. But the horrors didn't stop there. When investigators went further into the house, they made another devastating discovery. Brandy's children were found in the bathroom, stacked on top of each other in the bathtub. The tub was filled with water. Sadly, Brandy and Tamia had been shot, while Tanaya and Javante had been drowned. It appeared that the killer then placed Tamaya in the tub with her siblings, as though to add to the horror of it all. The signs of a struggle were everywhere. According to the police, the scene was even more gruesome than anyone could have imagined. The walls and ceilings were tainted with blood everywhere. It was clear that the violence had been intense, and the house itself was a chaotic mess. And you could tell Brandy fought desperately to protect her children, but in the end, her efforts weren't enough. There were no signs of a robbery, though. It wasn't about taking anything. Brandy didn't have much to steal, and the door wasn't even broken down. In fact, it was locked when the police arrived, making it seem like the attack had been carefully planned, carried out swiftly in the evening, likely just hours before they were discovered. The children had been wearing their pajamas, with their homework still out, suggesting they were just about to settle down for the night. They had no idea that someone, perhaps even more than one person, had slipped into their home. And to make things even worse, the phone had been ripped off the wall, its cord severed. It was as though the killer had taken every step to ensure that no one could call for help. It wasn't just a random act of violence. This was a carefully calculated, horrific plan. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Now, if you're wondering who could orchestrate something so brutal, well, let's break it down. As mentioned, there were no signs of forced entry, meaning this was undoubtedly a personal attack. The family likely knew the killer, someone they trusted, or at least didn't see as a threat. One person who was closely connected to the family was Henry Segura, the father of little Javante. He was interviewed and spoke with authorities the very day the bodies were found, and his role in all this would soon become a key part of the investigation.
And Javante is your child?
As it turns out, things weren't all rainbows and sunshine for Henry and Brandy after they met. At the time, Henry was already married to someone else, and his relationship with Brandy was more of a fling until she got pregnant. However, when the investigation turned to him, Henry had an alibi. He was interviewed, and he claimed that at the time of the murders, he was at home with his wife. His cell phone records supported this claim, and his wife confirmed his story. When questioned further, Henry described Brandy as spunky, sweet, and cool, saying they didn't have any bad blood between them. He seemed to paint the picture of a relationship that was friendly and casual, which only made the whole situation more perplexing.
Tell me about Brandy. What kind of person is she?
Spunky.
Okay.
She's down to earth. She's real sweet. She's a cool person.
Mm-hmm.
During this same interview, Henry did something that seemed to further distance him from suspicion. He asked the detective how his son, Javante, had been killed. To many, this question felt like the action of someone who wasn't guilty. Henry also shared how he and Brandy met, saying it happened about 4 years earlier at a gas station in Tallahassee. At that time, Henry admitted that his wife didn't know about their relationship, but according to him, Brandy didn't seem to mind that he was married.
You immediately started dating one another, or did she know you were married?
Yeah.
She had no problems with that? What about your wife, Malika? Does she know about...
Yeah, eventually.
Okay, eventually.
However, other sources painted a slightly different picture. At the time of their fling, Henry and his wife were reportedly on bad terms and not even living together. This complicated dynamic made it seem like Brandy wasn't necessarily stepping into a happy marriage, but rather a messy situation where lines were already blurred. But here's where things take a twist. During the interview, the detective noticed something odd. There were slight scratch marks on Henry's pinky finger. This raised immediate red flags. The officer asked Henry if he'd be willing to show more of his body, and upon inspection, there were additional red marks. When officers questioned Henry about the marks on his body, he had an explanation ready. He claimed they were from a gang fight in Tallahassee, adding that he had even been shot in the stomach during the incident. To further prove he had nothing to hide, Henry confidently volunteered his DNA for testing. His calm demeanor and willingness to cooperate seemed to steer suspicion away from him. But there was one detail that couldn't be ignored. Henry admitted he had doubts about being Javante's biological father. He explained that he was skeptical about whether Javante was truly his son, and even mentioned being under a court order to pay child support. Despite this, Henry insisted that his relationship with Brandy was nothing but positive. He described her as a caring mother and claimed they had always been on good terms, with no animosity between them. And according to him, on the day of the murder, he was nowhere near Brandy's house. He firmly insisted that he hadn't been there at all. However, he did admit to visiting Brandy just 2 days before the horrific incident. He claimed that was the last time he had any contact with her, standing by his story with unwavering confidence. Still, those doubts about Javante's paternity couldn't be overlooked. Was it possible that frustration over child support or lingering uncertainty had caused tension beneath the surface? Or was Henry truly the cooperative, innocent figure he appeared to be? The community was desperate for answers. People were terrified, urging officers to move quickly, because what if this was the work of a serial killer? After all, Tallahassee had a dark history of housing some of the most notorious criminals, including the infamous Ted Bundy and Gary Michael Hilton, both of whom had ties to the area. With the weight of the community's fear on their shoulders, the investigators turned their focus to the crime scene itself, combing every inch of Brandy's home for clues. What they found raised even more questions. Inside the house, investigators stumbled upon something that added a new layer of mystery to the case, a stack of love letters. But these weren't your typical roses are red, violets are blue kind of notes. These letters were allegedly from James Carlos Santos, a well-known drug dealer with a notorious reputation in Tallahassee. Now, Santos wasn't just any guy. He was currently behind bars and claimed to have some serious ties to criminal organizations. From his prison cell, Santos made bold and chilling claims that immediately grabbed the detective's attention. According to him, he was a key figure in a powerful criminal network, and Brandy Peters had been running drugs for him. But here's where things took a darker turn. Santos alleged that Brandy had been skimming cocaine from his operation, and once he discovered this betrayal, he claimed to have ordered her and her entire family to be killed. And Santos didn't stop there. He had receipts, or so he claimed. He pointed to letters and emails he'd sent to Brandy, even proposing marriage to her. In his mind, they had some kind of relationship, maybe even something serious. But when detectives dug a little deeper, the cracks in his story began to show. Turns out, this relationship was completely one-sided. Brandy wasn't romantically involved with Santos at all. What was also really interesting about Carlos Santos was that when investigators interviewed him and asked if he remembered any physical traits of Brandy, he struggled. In fact, he had a hard time recalling anything specific about her appearance at all. You would think that if he had been involved with her, especially in such a serious and shady way, he'd be able to describe her clearly. But instead, he gave vague answers, as though he couldn't even picture her face.
You don't remember what she looked like?
No.
Not at all. This girl that ran drugs for you all these years, you don't remember what she looked like? You don't remember how tall she was?
I just told you what she looked like. She was a dark-skinned black woman.
It didn't take long for detectives to realize Santos wasn't the reliable source he tried to portray himself as. In fact, they uncovered a long history of him making over-the-top claims about crimes he didn't commit. And it wasn't just detectives who were skeptical. A psychiatrist evaluated Santos and confirmed what they suspected. He was delusional and a pathological liar. Basically, Santos was living in a fantasy world, and his bold claims were more fiction than fact. However, the investigation didn't stop with Santos's false claims. In fact, it opened up more leads, thanks to the potential link to drug dealing. One of the most promising came from DNA found on the phone cord at the crime scene. This DNA was flagged as a possible match to a convicted drug smuggler living in Italy, a man who was suspected to be deeply involved with a notorious drug cartel. The connection seemed like it could be the break investigators needed. But here's the twist. When authorities reached out to this individual, instead of playing hard to get or going into hiding, he fully cooperated. He agreed to meet FBI agents at the U.S. Embassy in Rome and voluntarily handed over a DNA sample. This kind of openness suggested he wasn't involved, and indeed his DNA didn't match the evidence at the crime scene. To cover all bases, the DNA was compared to 4 other individuals from the national database, but none of them were a match. This lead, like many others, turned out to be a dead end. However, the drug angle didn't just stop with this one lead. It had already put the investigation in a different direction, sparking other possible connections. It kept pushing the investigators forward, even though it didn't ultimately solve the case. The discovery of the spade shovel at the crime scene had people speculating it might be a cartel's calling card. But once again, this theory fell apart. Why would a cartel leave a spade shovel when a simple ace of spades would have been easier to carry and much less obvious? Another thing that had the detectives so confused about this case was that there was another informant who came forward, claiming that he was involved in the murders. This informant, Gregory Washington, told the police that Demario Paramore had confessed to him that he, along with someone named Haywood Griffin, had carried out the brutal killings. But Griffin quickly denied any involvement, and the police didn't push the investigation into Paramore any further. Prosecutors argued that the conversation didn't actually qualify as a confession, so they dismissed it. But this wasn't the only wild theory. A lot of the so-called jailhouse snitches came forward with their own claims about the case, but many of them were suspected of just trying to cut deals to get their sentences reduced. In fact, one even admitted to asking for a lighter sentence in exchange for his tips. With the cartel hit theory and the claims from jailhouse snitches pretty much squashed and no solid leads coming from the drug connection, the investigation shifted its focus back to the suspects who were much closer to the victims. The father of the twin girls, Timaya and Tanaya, was briefly considered as a suspect in the case. However, given that he was incarcerated at the time of the murders, authorities quickly ruled him out. Multiple sources did reveal, though, that he was devastated by the news of the killings, even though he hadn't been able to form many memories with the twins due to his situation. It was clear that he wasn't involved, but the heartbreak was still there. That left only one remaining suspect who had both the motive and opportunity: Henry Segura. He was actually interviewed again 10 days after the murders, and this time the prosecutors were determined to push him until he cracked. It turns out that Henry owed Brandy a massive $20,000 in unpaid child support. According to the detectives, the only way Henry could see to get out of this financial mess was either to go to jail for not paying or to eliminate the problem altogether. And in his mind, that meant getting rid of Brandy and Javante. The prosecution's theory was chilling. If Brandy died, Henry wouldn't have to worry about paying child support for their son, Javante. However, if Javante had been the one to die instead of Brandy, Henry would still be stuck with the child support payments. So, in Henry's twisted logic, Brandy and the child had to go. And according to the prosecutors, the two twin girls were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The girls were supposed to be at their grandmother's house, but when Henry showed up at the house, they became part of the tragic scene. They were innocent victims of Henry's brutal plan. In the second round of questioning, Henry really started to lose his cool. When the detectives told him they had spoken with some of his girlfriends to dig into his background, he got furious. It was as if he knew the walls were closing in on him and he was starting to panic. Now, you might remember that Henry had previously used his phone to prove that he was home on the day of the murders. But what he didn't tell the detectives was that he had another phone, one that he didn't mention at all. At first, Henry lied and said he wasn't anywhere near Brandy's house that day. But when the investigators uncovered the secret phone, the GPS data from that phone put him right at the crime scene. That was a game changer. The evidence was there, and it couldn't be ignored. So Henry finally changed his story. He admitted that he had been at Brandy's house that day, but here's where things get even weirder. He claimed that he wasn't there to kill her. Instead, he said he was there to have sex with her, and he didn't want to admit it at first because he was afraid his wife would find out.
You were there Friday. Okay.
I was at her house Friday.
You were there Friday.
How you figure this?
Okay. I'm telling you, you were there Friday. Okay. You can't think that when something like this happens, that they're not going to find evidence. Okay. You can't think that. We have to.
After that intense interview, Henry Segura was officially labeled as the prime suspect in the murder of Brandy Peters and her 3 children. But as expected, he wasn't going to go down without a fight. Henry quickly hired a top-notch lawyer who was more than capable of trying to spin the story in his favor. And it wasn't until a year later that Henry was finally arrested after fleeing to LeSueur County, Minnesota, following the murders. It took a year because the investigation had hit several dead ends, including the whole drug cartel theory, which ultimately led to nothing. When the trial finally kicked off, Henry's defense team tried to argue that the lack of his DNA at the crime scene was solid proof that he wasn't involved in the murders. They even claimed that he had just been there for a casual visit with Brandy, nothing more, nothing sinister. When Henry was asked why he had lied to the police during his initial interviews, he simply said,
"And yet you're asking this jury to believe everything you have to say today."
Yes, because in the process of me lying and doing all this lying, I had a whole lot of time to sit down and think about all the mistakes I made, all the kids I had outside of my marriage, and I've learned how to right my wrongs.
The case quickly took a turn when Kelsey Kennard, Henry's former cellmate in an Oklahoma jail, came forward to testify. Kennard shocked everyone by revealing that Henry had confessed to him back in 2011. According to Kennard, Henry had gone into disturbing detail about the murders, about how he killed Brandy and her 2 daughters. Despite this bombshell testimony and all the mounting evidence, the jury just couldn't reach a consensus. After hours of deliberation, the jury ended up in a deadlock with an 8-4 vote in favor of acquittal. With no unanimous decision, the judge had no choice but to declare a mistrial in 2017. The last trial took place in November of 2019, nearly a decade after the horrific murders. Henry Segura was finally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the trial, the defense tried to argue that a drug cartel was behind the killings, but the jury wasn't convinced. Despite Segura's insistence on his innocence, the evidence against him was overwhelming. His DNA was found at the crime scene, and his statements kept changing. All of this pointed to him being the killer. As for Henry, he didn't show much emotion. He quietly spoke with his lawyer and nodded to his family. But one of his family members couldn't keep it together and screamed in the courtroom. She was quickly escorted out by bailiffs who threatened to arrest her. It's chilling to think it took so many years before justice was finally served, and all we can do now is hope that Brandy and her kids are at peace. But what do you think? Was it really all about child support, or was there something more going on behind the scenes? Maybe the cartel theory wasn't as far-fetched as it seemed? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm dying to hear what you think. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.